Welcome, everybody. Thanks for taking part in another London Futurists experiment in finding ways to collaborate online, something we should all have been doing more in the past and which the current lockdown is encouraging us to do better. This is my first experiment using Crowdcast. I trust the technology is going to go well. There's a slight chance my video might freeze at some stage. Please just be patient. I think it will only be a temporary state of affairs. I'm going to share my screen for a short while. I'm going to lay out some initial thoughts on this topic of risks beyond COVID. And then I'm going to welcome comments from the audience. I may happily invite some of you online. So COVID-19 has brought out some of the really good aspects of humanity. There's many remarkable stories of people helping each other, being compassionate, being sacrificial, but at the same time, it's clear that we weren't adequately prepared for this, and our systems are under great stress and strain. We weren't adequately prepared for COVID, and questions that futurists would like to ask, well, what else aren't we prepared for? More generally, why aren't we better prepared? And how could we change our systems, our culture, not just talking about things, but actually adding suitable resilience, redundancy, agility, intelligence, information, whatever, so that we're better prepared for future risks and opportunities. Futurists have been talking about pandemics for a long time. Here's just one example. It's from an impressive, good organization, the Millennium Project, set up as a joint initiative from the United Nations University and a couple of other bodies more than 20 years ago. And for each of these 20 years, the organization has laid out in an annual report, State of the Future, 15 issues which deserve serious attention. You can see here the State of the Future report all the way from 1997 up to the most recent one. And going back to the very first, the fourth issue was the threat of new and re-emerging diseases and immune microorganisms is growing due to mass migrations, international travel, increased urbanization, increased population density. And by the way, this wasn't in the report, but it does seem to be the case that the number of infectious diseases outbreaks is increasing, by some measures even as much as tripling between 1980 and 2013. So the information is there, and the Millennium Project even warns that this is a trend that holds the capacity to bring life as we know it to a grinding halt. But despite this warnings, and despite the warnings of lots of other people, somehow society didn't quite pay attention. At about the same time, 1996, in fact, the Canadian philosopher John Leslie kicked a lot of this field into a new state of progress. He surveyed a lot of the science of possible means of human extinction, and they covered that in his book 1997. So that was a philosopher talking about science. A bit later on, the distinguished scientist in the UK, Martin Rees, in 2003 wrote his book about extinction and dabbled in philosophy as well. He is the former Astronomer Royal, the former Master of Trinity College, Cambridge, and I confess that in the early 1980s, I sat as a young student in his lectures on cosmology in Cambridge. In that book, he suggested that there was a 50% possibility, only a 50% possibility, that humanity would survive the 21st century. And he set out his reasons in that book. The field advanced further, I think, due to a big conference in 2008 in Oxford, a 3-day conference that I vividly remember attending, along with many of the authors of chapters in this volume. That was one of the first major public initiatives from the Future of Humanity Institute, which had been set up a few years earlier at Oxford, and which remains to this date one of the premier organisations looking at existential risks and also looking at why society isn't paying sufficient attention to existential risks. There are other such bodies. The Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, sometimes known as CSER, was founded in Cambridge in part because of a shared cab journey between a technologist, Jan Tallinn from Skype, who was in a cab with a Cambridge philosopher, Hugh Price, and Jan Tallinn mentioned that he thought he was himself more likely to die from a catastrophic event than from heart disease or cancer. And as a result of that, the Centre for Existential Risk got going. And I should mention, well, there are many other organizations that could be mentioned, including issues, including around the world, but I should mention this one in Boston, the Future of Life Institute, set up with people from MIT and elsewhere, led by Max Tegmark. To bring the subject more up to date, there are two, I think, fine books in recent times on this. There's one by a Time journalist who I think makes a very good job last August of looking at many of the issues in a way that can engage the general public. A brief guide to the end of the world, asteroids, supervolcanoes, rogue robots, and more. And most recently, again, a book by the Oxford philosopher Toby Ord last month called The Precipice: Existential Risk and the Future of Humanity. And what I'm going to try and do in the next 15 to 20 minutes is to try and summarize some of what I consider to be key points from these two books, other books and conferences I've attended over the years that I've been looking at this, and then I will open up for a wider discussion. Now, people make a distinction between three sorts of source of risk for end of the world scenarios. There is the natural category, which would affect humans but aren't particularly caused by humans, things like asteroids and supervolcanoes. There are the ones that are caused by human technology that we already have today, things like nuclear devastation from a nuclear war, climate change running away. And there's a third category, which is, again, caused by humans, but would involve technology that will be developed in the future. Technology such as bioengineering, which could lead to more deadly pathogens, technology such as more powerful artificial general intelligence. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment here because I did submit a poll for people to answer, and maybe we'll take a moment now for all of you to look at a poll, which you can find, I think, at the bottom of your screen. It says polls 1. If you click on that, you have the chance to express your view as to whether you think that there is bigger danger from natural risks, bigger danger from human-caused risks from today's technology, or bigger risks from future technologies. So that's coming out relatively evenly spread. There's now 48 apparently people watching this live. So slight preference there to human-caused risks using today's technology. Well, we'll see what the various speakers on this, the books that I have mentioned, have to say on that topic. So let's dive in. Let's look at the chart here, which shows for each of the years from 1887 up till 2018, the number of deaths in the UK. Now, other things being equal, we might expect this graph to rise because there are more people in the UK. So if deaths were at a constant ratio, it would go up. We might also expect the line to go down because of improvements in healthcare. I can tell you that the average number of deaths in any year was 615,000 over that period, with some standard deviation of 41,000. But you may notice that there is one year that stands out more than any of the others, which is 1918, which shows 715,000 deaths, which is 2.5 standard deviations above the mean, which is significantly more than any of the other years. So I see at least one of you having trouble following the seminar. Hopefully others are able to follow along. I think my internet connection. So some people are saying it's working well. Some people saying it's trouble. I need to figure out for myself. I'm getting more goods than bad, so I will continue. Thank you. So this graph is sort of a hidden part of history. It's become more known in recent times as we have talked about pandemics, but for a long time, this surge in deaths in 1918 was not widely discussed. It was not part of the history I grew up learning. At school, I learned a lot about the First World War, quite rightly, the lessons to be drawn from that, the risks of Europe or wider world drifting unintentionally into a global confrontation, but it was not clear that many more people actually died in that flu than had died in that First World War. And it was not clear that probably we should be studying that more seriously. It's sort of the same, in fact, with the Napoleonic Wars. Again, a fascinating piece of history, but it turns out, by coincidence, that the next year, 1816, probably deserves a lot more attention than before. I wonder if any of you know what was special about 1816. Sometimes known as the year without a summer, sometimes also called 1800 and froze to death. As was talked about in North America, this was the last year in which there were significant food shortages throughout large parts of the Northern Hemisphere, due not to Krakatoa, but due to another volcano nearby, as covered in this book, The Year Without Summer. I think the picture's a bit misleading. I think the explosion was a much more devastating than that. Sometimes called volcanic explosivity index 7, volcanic eruption. These eruptions go from 1 up to 8 on a log scale. It dumped huge amounts of ash into the stratosphere, where it stayed for several years, shutting down a lot of the summer. So that was Tambora in Indonesia, 1915, a larger bang than Krakatoa, as it turns out. For comparison, the largest earthquake in the recorded recent history of the United States was St. Helens, which was 2 orders of magnitude less. There's a lot of discussion about the Pinatubo volcano in the Philippines because it has had a measurable impact on global temperatures. As a result of that, global temperatures seem to have dipped by about 1 degree worldwide. But these are still smaller than some larger volcanoes that happened. According to at least some historians, the worst year to have been alive was, don't know if any of you would hazard a guess as to the worst year to be alive, 536, at least according to the historian Michael McCormack, which was the start of the coldest decade in the past 2,300 years, with lots of records from China and Europe and elsewhere of a devastating downturn in the climate. Some people said it caused the conditions in which a terrible flu, the plague of Justinian, spread, and so forth. So there's a lot more we should be studying about history. Although some people who are living further back might take issue with 536 being the worst year to be alive, it is sometimes said that the closest humanity came to extinction was in 74,000 due to an enormous super eruption in Toba, Indonesia, which is believed to have emitted 2,800 times as much material as St. Helens. It would have filled most of the Grand Canyon if all that material had been assembled. and there is evidence, some dispute, that humanity almost went extinct at that time. Will Durant, the historian and philosopher, said in the course of his survey of human history, civilization exists by geological consent, subject to change without notice. Well, our question, of course, is it really without notice? Will we have a chance to do something about it? But it does seem to be the case that we have sometimes seen mass extinctions throughout vast geological history. This survey by Peter Brannan in his book from a few years back, The Ends of the World, Volcanic Apocalypses, Lethal Oceans, and Our Quest to Understand Earth's Past Mass Extinctions. There's a lot of volcanic apocalypses which are believed to have been the cause of several of the 5 mass extinctions. What about today? We have, it's believed, about 20 super volcanoes that could, in principle, give a super eruption of VEI 8 level. The most famous is Yellowstone in National Park in America. It is believed to have had an enormous super eruption 640,000 years ago. Does that mean another one's due? It's worth studying. It turns out that people don't think another one's particularly likely. It's viewed that in the next century, there's something like a 1 in 7,000 chance of this erupting again with similar magnitude, which is, as we'll see, relatively small compared to the other risks of extinction. But it is a subject to explore. What might we do about it if we notice a super eruption is pending? Would it be worthwhile to try to drill and somehow tap and remove that energy? Or might such an intervention actually have unintended side effects that would make the eventual super eruption sooner and worse? Now, that's one of 18 risks that I'm going to list in these opening remarks. I'm not going to go through all 18 similarly. That's just an example of some of the study that people have looked at and which I believe should be much more common in every educational program. People should be learning about it in school. We could also talk about a number of other natural risks. The magnetic poles have reversed various times in recorded history. Might it happen again? It probably will at some stage. Will it be devastating for humanity? It will probably cause problems. To what extent are the problems tractable? It's not entirely clear. It's not going to cause the end of humanity, but I think we should look at all issues that will cause various serious problems and set civilization back. There have been occasional major solar discharges. In 1859, there was a discharge which doesn't seem to have been matched since. It's known as the Carrington event, which did serious damage to the emerging communications infrastructure of the time, the telegraph lines. It has been estimated that if something similar happened today, possibly £1 trillion of damage would be caused. Are we ready for it? Probably not. Are we studying it enough? Probably not. Then there's asteroids, like the collision which 66 million years ago is likely the cause of one of the 5 mass extinctions, the most recent one, bringing into extinction dinosaurs along with many other large animals. What's interesting is that this has only recently become understood as a global risk of serious proportions. It was only in 1980 that people hypothesized that there had been an asteroid smashing into the Earth at about the time of that mass extinction, when geologists started noticing lots of metal called iridium at the geological boundary, and noticed that there was lots more iridium in asteroids than in the Earth. Even then, it seemed like a fantasy until people about 10 or 20 years later became more convinced that there was a large crater in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. So this is a warning that we might be oblivious to some of the major dangers. Gamma ray bursts come under the same category. These were only discovered in the last 30 or 40 years, when satellites were put into space to try and track evidence of nuclear blasts, in which there would be lots of gamma rays emitted. They wanted to find out, the Americans wanted to find out if the Soviets might be cheating on their nuclear tests, and instead they found out other huge gamma ray bursts coming from deep space. If one of them hit the Earth straight on, it might be curtains. Can we do better to detect them? Can we do better to prepare? Again, an open question. And then there's the possibility of even more swings in the climate, such as extreme ice ages known as a snowball Earth. But there's an interesting argument which Toby Ord makes in his book, which I think is a good one. He says that we can draw a reasonable upper bound estimate for the probability of a natural existential disaster that would wipe out humanity or would lead humanity into a state from which civilization would be unlikely to recover. And that is to observe that anatomically modern Homo sapiens have been around for about 2,000 centuries. And so that gives a sort of upper bound of probability that there is around an upper bound of 1 in 2,000 for the probability of a natural existential disaster happening in any century. That doesn't mean to say we can stop paying attention, but it does suggest that there may be more pressing risks to pay attention to. For the record, what Toby Ord highlights as the most serious of this category of risks and deserving most attention is super volcanoes. And there is some discussion that we need to pay more attention to comets. Comets come from further out in the solar system. We believe we have a good understanding of where all the really large near-Earth asteroids are. We believe we've found most of the ones that could cause existential damage, and they are very unlikely to hit Earth in the foreseeable future. There are smaller numbers of comets, but there are more larger ones, so that might be worth studying further. Let's move on to risks with today's technology. There is the risk of nuclear explosions leading to nuclear winter. I said earlier that some people think that 74,000 BC was the time that humanity in its 2,000 centuries came the closest to extinction. You can perhaps read that by looking at the genetic variability and doing some clever calculations. Other people would say, no, the closest we came to extinction was in recent times with very near misses from accidental nuclear wars, possibly in 1983 or possibly in the Cuban Missile Crisis 1962. Again, I would commend Toby Ord's book for his discussion of some of these near misses in which we might have ended up in a very ugly exchange of weapons, unintentional. I'll mention about nuclear winter that it's another example of something that has only recently become understood as its full potential to do damage to humanity. The first nuclear test, of course, was in 1945. And as the nuclear arsenals grew, people realized there was the risks of huge numbers of people being killed, hundreds of millions, were the figures in some of the analysis that have been made. But people still tended to assume that a significant number of humans would survive. That was until there was the analysis of Carl Sagan and others in the early 1980s that the biggest long-term consequence of lots of nuclear explosions is something similar to the supervolcano. Lots of dust and soot in the air, causing potentially many years of extreme cold, lack of food. Then there is the complication that more of our weapon systems are under automated control. There are more AI systems that are involved in gauging the likelihood of an attack and perhaps of deciding whether a response is appropriate. Several of the near misses in the past came from systems that wrongly calculated that an attack was imminent. Thankfully, in all these cases so far, humans intervened and said that they disagreed with what the apparent AI system was saying at the time. But we are moving to greater adoption of lethal autonomous weapon systems for all kinds of reasons, and this complicates the calculations. We could talk about climate change. We could talk about the risks, not just that we might have extreme environmental situations, which could raise the temperature 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees, but the possibilities, which are outlying possibilities with lower probability, but still need to be attended to, that there could be sharp positive feedback cycles, similar to what may have happened in these earlier incidents of mass extinction. Other environmental stresses, honeybees. Sometimes Einstein is quoted as saying, if the honeybee goes extinct, humanity will follow soon behind. Turns out Einstein said no such thing, and it turns out that although it would be a great shame if there were no honeybees, humanity would continue, but there are plenty of other environmental stresses that deserve attention. Plagues, including more antibiotic-resistant infections. We'll talk more about them shortly. There are other contagions which wouldn't cause the end of humanity, but might plunge us into a collapse of society. A bit like some people are starting to fear might happen now. I don't believe that the lockdown is going to lead to a massive collapse of society, but it is having unexpected consequences with more and more companies on the risk of going out of business. I'm very worried personally about another kind of contagion, which is the contagion of rampant malware, in which various kinds of viruses, not the biological kind, but the software kind, often do unexpected damage, especially as we are more connected. This might cause huge damage. And then there is other risks that we will be hacked, not so much by malware, but by systems put in place by governments, whether it's 1984 authoritarian governments, or will we be distracted to death, as happened in Brave New World. Yes, I will make these slides available shortly afterwards, and you'll be able to watch the recording again via the same URL. The three of these lists, on this list, the three that Toby Ord picks out as most needing attention are the first three, and they're all at least one order of magnitude more likely than the natural risks highlighted before. Final category, the risks that human technology might lead to, that future technology might lead to. I vividly remember from that conference back in 2008 discussions whether the CERN laboratory, with its more energetic collision of elementary particles than had ever been done before, might trigger some exotic new physics, the creation of a black hole, the collapse of the vacuum, and other unexpected exotic states. And people eventually convinced themselves sufficiently that even if there were more energetic collisions, the world wouldn't be destroyed. But it certainly was an argument worth having. There's risks of us trying to step in to solve global warming with geoengineering, some of which we already have in place, others is which are being developed. And it's a complicated system, the geoclimate, and we have a risk of pushing it in the wrong direction. That needs serious attention too. In terms of plagues, which I didn't say much about before, I agree with the analysis that what we have seen so far is nothing like as bad as what we might see, in which there may be new pathogens which have been engineered to be more deadly than the ones we already have. There were some experiments done with variants of flu, joining two variants of flu together to make them both highly transmissible and more deadly. These were done in labs and haven't been released. There are also discussions that sometimes there are pathogens which are released accidentally from labs. It's too early to say whether that is the cause of the COVID pandemic. It's a possibility. After all, Britain has been responsible for some leaks of highly dangerous pathogens in the past. In fact, the last person on Earth to die of smallpox was, if I remember the date correctly, in Birmingham around about 1984, in a sad case in which a medical photographer became infected by a smallpox strain that was meant to be secure but somehow leaked out, probably through a heating and ventilation system. In that case, that was only one, but there have been other instances around the world, more in Britain, some in the Soviet Union, some in elsewhere. And we have to bear in mind, there are some groups like Om Shinriko, a Japanese group, kind of spin-off of Buddhism, which took it upon themselves to try and kill huge numbers of people with sarin gas. They investigated other deadly mechanisms. They had some very bright people working for them. Yes, 99.99% of the Earth is not going to want to do such a thing, but we do have, sadly, some people who, for various pathological reasons, take it in their minds to want to do this. As well as risks of biotech gone wrong, there is the risk of nanotech going wrong, cognotech going wrong, or AI going wrong. With the risks of AI becoming more powerful and then not being fully controllable by humans. And then there's the category of unknown risks from technology, which we can't yet formulate. And there is an example here of which people did calculate in advance, which goes back to the days of the very first nuclear explosion. Some of the physicists wondered if the temperature in that first test explosion in 1945 might ignite a runaway fusion reaction involving possibly the nitrogen in the sky or possibly part of the ocean. And there were lots of calculations made to ensure that was unlikely. It turns out that in Germany, some similar fears arose too in their atomic weapons program, of which Werner Heisenberg was at least associated. And these fears apparently came to the attention of Hitler, who wasn't very impressed. And that might have been one of the reasons why Hitler directed attention onto the V1 and V2 missile programs instead of accelerating Germany's own Manhattan Project. Anyway, there's an example that there could be unexpected consequences of technology we don't yet know. Toby assesses two of these as being second equal in terms of their risk: the bioengineered pathogens created by a mix of human malice, human stupidity, human idiocy, to echo some of the comments in the chat, and unknown risks from technology we don't yet know. And the risk that he calculates as the most likely to destroy us is super AI misaligned with human flourishing, which he calculates, well, let's state the probabilities, 1 in 30, these two have a chance, in his view, of causing the extinction of humanity sometime in this century. And the AI risk he calculates as 1 in 10, made up of saying, well, there's probably a 50% chance, according to AI experts, that we will have general intelligent AI sometime this century. Personally, I think it's a much higher probability than 50%, but that is what some surveys have come up with, 50% chance of general intelligence by the 2060s. And he says, in that case, there's still only an 80% chance that we will fully control it, in which case it works out compound 1 in 10 chance of destroying humanity. And there's a higher chance of it doing devastatingly bad things. I'm not going to go into that more, although we can pick it up in the chat. I've discussed that often in other sessions. If we add these risks together, it comes out at about a 1 in 6 chance of humanity being destroyed in this century. And you will notice that these risks there are higher than all of the others. Well, how do we prioritize? If some of this is making people think we should put more of humanity's attention onto these risks, how do we decide which of these 18, and of course there's a much longer list, deserve significant attention? And of course, it's some combination of probability, the ones that are more likely to happen, and scale, with, I think, a bias towards the risks that could see long tails. So for climate change, for example, there is a lot of people paying attention to climate change, so it's by no means a neglected risk. Lots and lots of people are studying the scenarios which are the so-called mainstream scenarios, but arguably there isn't enough attention on the possibilities of runaway positive feedback cycles, which could cause, let's say, 9 degrees or 15 degrees of a temperature rise in a short space of time. And even if that's just a small probability, it's probably working out as a larger risk than, say, asteroid impact. How tractable is it? That's another issue that sometimes people bring into the equation. If there's something that can be done about it, well, let's get on and do it. That makes sense. Although I also think that if we don't see a way of solving a particular existential problem, that also means we need to think about it harder too. The recommendation, however, from many of these institutes, the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, the group in Boston and others, is we should look not just at the individual risks, but also at what's known as risk factors, factors that make each of the other risks more likely, factors that will deprive the other risks of sufficient attention, things like ignorance. If we don't know about these issues, then they're more likely to creep up on us and cause damage. If we are collectively irrational, if we are too easily misled by stories about 5G, rather than paying attention to the more serious risks, if our social media is full of things that have no real credence, then it makes it less likely we can attend properly to this. If we end up in situations of war, then people's tolerance for risk goes up. People are more likely to do dangerous things. And then finally, there is the fact that when we are in a time of recession, as might happen with climate change, then again, we have less money, other things being equal, to devote to studying these risks. And there are problems of institutions being shut down. Therefore, we should be looking at growing education in risk management, improving overall rationality, instilling spirit of collaboration, and yes, boosting prosperity, other things being equal, so that there is more money available for these work. There's another risk factor which makes attention to risks less likely, which is that many people are psychologically unwilling to think seriously about existential risks. And I'm going to address that in my final few minutes of remarks by looking at some discussion of a previous collapse, not a big collapse in the sense of being an existential problem, but in the response to the financial crunch of 2008, when famously the Queen afterwards went to opening of a new facility at the London School of Economics and happened to ask the economists why no one had predicted that credit crunch. And the answers eventually came back. Yes, some people had predicted it, but it hadn't received anything like enough attention because of, well, a feel-good factor, which meant that people didn't want to delve into any evidence that underneath the feel-good factor, there were some worrying parameters. There was a psychology of denial. This was also mentioned in the letter that the economists eventually submitted to Queen Elizabeth. And there was overtrust in people who we sort of wanted to believe were right. The financial wizards who told us that there were all the problems of macroeconomics had been solved, and they managed to convince themselves and the world's politicians that the risk was now a thing of the past. So, why risks lack attention? 6 reasons. There is this bias of humanity to prefer optimists to pessimists. To listen to optimists, they're generally more successful than pessimists. They generally do more. And on the whole, that's good. But we need to counteract that with constructive narratives of pessimism that will help people to overcome their fears and to put their fear at least on hold to look more seriously at this. Then there is a short-term bias. So much of society, whether it's the political society or the business society, is oriented around short-term cycles. And sadly, even futurism is often oriented in practical terms around short-term issues. Often when I go to talk to groups of people, they're more interested in what they can do to make business successful investment in the next few years, and they're less interested in longer term issues that might require social change. So we need to have advocates for the future. Just like there's been successful examples of positive discrimination to address other biases. We've had people speaking up for children, we've had people speaking up for women, we've had people speaking up for other minorities, other underrepresented groups. Arguably, we need to give more attention to future advocates. Then there's a problem of risk mitigation being what's known as a public good, I'm sorry. The public good, meaning that if people work to address it, the benefits apply to everyone, and the people who put in the effort don't particularly benefit from it. So each individual is loath to bear the costs. Companies are loath to investigate these things because they won't gain any particular advantage themselves out of it. There's an additional answer to ensuring that there is sufficient attention to these public goods, of course, is this is the kind of things that governments can often coordinate. But there's a bigger problem here, which is that many of these risks extend beyond individual countries. And we have the fact that any individual country is loath to bear the cost alone. So there's often a cry against Britain taking the lead in climate change initiatives. They say, oh, this will be pointless unless India and China are doing more too. That is what's heard. Hence, many people are afraid of global coordination. There's a fear of world government. There's a fear that's going to lead to a loss of sovereignty, a fear it's going to lead into some terrible totalitarian regime, which would be a cure worse than the problem. I think we have to answer this by pointing to good examples of lean international coordination in which sovereignty is respected, but some elements of communication and agreements are developed. A simple example is that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev and Kennedy agreed to put in place a telephone hotline between the two of them in order that they could communicate more quickly rather than messages taking a day or so to go between them. Finally, lots of people are afraid of discussing risks because they're afraid that's going to lead to Luddite anti-technology initiatives. It's afraid it's going to slow down technology progress. And again, the argument is that we better not slow down what we're doing because we're the good guys, and if we just leave it to the bad guys, they're going to do it even worse than us. That is the case for my final proposal, which is a risk management framework, which has 6 components. We need to analyze scenarios in advance, a bit like I did a little bit early on, but a whole lot more depth, in which we call upon people from multiple disciplines and diverse perspectives to try and kick tires in our scenarios for progress, to try and identify risks before they happen, to try and speculate on what solutions might be. However, as well as just having scenarios in advance and figuring out what our best choices are likely to be, we need to monitor constantly in case some of the assumptions in these scenarios turn out to be not true. So when we're introducing, for example, new genetically modified organisms, the evidence may say, the theories may say there's unlikely to be any damage, but we'd better watch in case for any developments different from what was expected. However, this is only going to work if people are sufficiently open and transparent, valuing the data over ideology, avoiding the tendency to cover things up which are uncomfortable or inconvenient for their own particular pet projects. And sadly, we have seen several times in recent history examples of pathogens, their outbreaks not being sufficiently communicated early enough. And there was also cases of countries which declared that they had signed up to stop all experimentation with biological weapons, but that wasn't actually the case. We also need a rapid response capability. We are not going to be able to anticipate everything in advance. We don't know the timing. This doesn't just mean we have storage of equipment. It's impossible to store all the equipment we need, but we need to have faster and more reliant systems to get good equipment quickly, with an emphasis on agility. Not that we're going to cut corners altogether, but we learn how to make changes quickly. None of this is going to happen without a step up of international funding. The WHO, the WHO, has some limitations. It's been criticized in some ways for its responses. They might respond in turn that they have been underfunded. I think that's true. I think there are other bodies that do need to be funded in a similar way. Some people will say, well, this will never happen, but I draw attention to the fact that in times of crisis, people are more open to creating new international bodies like the United Nations and other so-called institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. They were put into place after the trauma of the Second World War. This is a chance to put new institutions into place. But also, most importantly, we're going to need ongoing effective communications to ensure that we figure out how to keep the public on board, we keep the public engaged, and critically, we get their insights. We need to have vivid, credible, open communications. So we build sufficient support for having these groups, the groups that are doing the analysis, the monitoring, the groups that are preparing rapid response on an international level. Finally, let's talk about communications. This is from a slide I presented at Bloomberg in November 2015, talking about the good work of the Millennium Project. And I emphasize on here, as I said at the start of this, that there was the issue there of the threat of new and re-emerging diseases and immune microorganisms. We need to pay attention to this. But you may notice this sort of gets lost among other issues, and I confess this was slide 12 out of 30. The communication was not bad. We just have to be better at communicating clearly, sharply, using multiple mechanisms. So in conclusion, I think we need to be smarter and more vigorous in developing a risk management framework that addresses risk factors as well as individual risks, that encourages better education, teaches people how to reason, encourages collaboration, encourages prosperity, and a word I didn't have on my earlier slide, encourages courage in looking honestly into the long tails of these scenarios. That encourages people to do this, but without losing focus on individual risks, and which encourages people to look not just at what can go wrong, not just at what can go badly wrong, but what could go wonderfully right. And that's something that the final section of Toby Ord's book does very well, in my view, looking at the larger possibilities for what humanity could become. It's part of effective communications that isn't just lecturing, it's using the right ways to engage people. And finally, it's time to raise this at the highest levels of government too. The new cabinet should have a minister for the future, in my view. So that's my final slide. I haven't been paying too much to attention to the chat. I'm very interested now in bringing some people into the discussion. Is there anything in the Q&A window? Not there yet. Perhaps Keith Mansfield. I'm going to ask you to join the discussion if you are still interested, and giving some words of response to what you have heard. So I'm trying to invite you up on the screen, Keith, accepting and connecting.
Got me, David?
Hi, Keith.
Excellent. And thank you for your fabulous talk.
So maybe you can introduce yourself and give some thoughts as to any points of disagreement or points you would want to highlight further.
Okay, so thank you for that. I apologize. I only saw David's tweet 2 minutes before going live, so I haven't prepared anything for this, but I'm a science publisher. So I published the Global Catastrophic Risks book that he's talked about, and Superintelligence from Ostrom, and Ollie Hagstrom's Here Be Dragons, which is another book in this area. And I worked on some of Toby Ord's book, The Precipice, here at the Future of Humanity Institute, even though I wasn't the official publisher for it, but I've done some editing of it. And I'd just like to mention 2 points, if I may, on the basis of the presentation. Okay.
Please.
So what Toby Ord makes a real distinction between is existential risk versus global catastrophic risk. And Toby is a moral philosopher, and he's a big player in this movement called effective altruism. And a global catastrophic risk is something that could be really terrible for humanity. Say we've got 7.7 billion people on the planet now, and if 7 billion of them died, that would be horrendous. But it's quite likely that humanity could go on and might recover and still achieve its potential. Whereas an existential risk is drawing a line under humanity as our species, and it's the end of us. And that's very important for Toby, because what he's thinking about is future humans and post-humans, transhumans. And if we survive, and if we survive long enough, then we will ultimately, inevitably expand in different ways, virtually and into space and whatever. And there will be trillions and trillions of us, and they will be able to do incredible amounts of good. And none of that good will be done if humanity is dead. So that's the kind of rationale behind what he's doing. So for Toby, even though it's horrifying to think about it, he actually thinks that a nuclear war would ultimately probably be survivable, and humans would rebuild, and it would be a horrendous thing, but we could come back from it. So I think what David was saying about the quantification of risk was really, really important. And that figure you use for the natural risk of 1 in 2,000 of a natural risk per century is a good figure. And that's explained very well. And there's actually also a Nature paper that was published to that effect. And when you look at risks from potential future technologies, what he's saying is there is a risk of 20% around quantified per century of humans actually becoming extinct. And if you think about that, then that's unsustainable. We cannot continue to live century by century with such a high risk of not going on any further. And that's why his book is called The Precipice. And he thinks of this era in humanity as a precipice that we're walking at the moment. And when we get through it, hoping that we do get through it, if we think about these risks that David's talking about, then future humans and transhumans, posthumans will look back on this era as that time when we were forced to change our thinking and become future focused and think about the long-term survival of the species. So that was what I was going to say, David.
Yes, so thanks for that, Keith. Well, let's maybe get you to help me answering a couple of the questions that are in the Q&A. There's a question there of how do we sort the signal from the noise? There are 1,000 predictions every day of war, famine, pestilence. How do we know which of them to pay attention to? Is there a simple answer for that?
And so the quantification is a good thing. anything can sound terrible when you reason about it in qualitative terms, but when you actually quantify things, then I think that is the way of separating signal from noise myself. And the analysis in Toby's book is very I mean, it's a very, very difficult thing to do, but I feel he's done a great job of being as rigorous as it is possible to be at this point in time, but also to think like good Bayesians in a way. And David talked about becoming more rational as humans in how we approach life generally, and part of being a good Bayesian is adjusting your ideas based upon new evidence. So it's important to always be open to new evidence of new risks, and especially because we don't know all the technologies and all the risks at the moment, as you pointed out with, say, Carl Sagan and nuclear winter and things like that.
Right. We're also now joined by Tim Pendry. I've invited a couple of people up on the screen. Not everybody is able to join me. We only in this system can have 4 at a time. So after you've been here for a while, I might ask you to step back.
I'm happy to be cut off.
But Tim, you've been raising various points in the chat too. What points would you want to highlight and ask about?
Well, I was pleasantly surprised to be asked to contribute, but I'd like to draw a distinction between two separate things. One is those things we can actually survive, and those things we can do, those things that we can do something about, and the consequences of those things. So, for example, if you talk about a gamma ray, from what I understand of it, there's very little we can do to survive that. It's also extremely rare. The things that we should be concerned about are those things that we can do something about. So the analysis has to be, which of these things can we do something about? And then from that point, what exactly would happen to the human race if they happened? And then make a moral analysis, since we've been talking about Toby's work on moral philosophy, a moral analysis of what it is precisely we should do. So, for example, I used in my notes as I was writing this the example of the sad business of what does not kill strengthens you. So I gave the example, which is a grim one, of the Jewish people being faced by National Socialism. National Socialism murdered 6 million, but the Jewish people is stronger than it's ever been today. This is something about the human condition we have to face, which is morally very difficult. That as a species, we grow through struggle. We grow through having to face horrific situations and coming out of it. And part of our problem here is there are some situations, which I think David's drawn attention to rather brilliantly, excellent presentation, where we know we cannot survive them and we cannot do anything about them. But there are some situations where we can go through them, and as a species, we will get stronger, we will survive them. And yet our moral sentiments are saying, actually, we don't want to go through that. So, for example, if we'd had a choice, if the Jewish people had a choice in 1930, they would not have gone through the Holocaust. They would not have gone through it. They would still be a people living in shtetls in Eastern Europe and living in a very different situation. And these are the moral questions that I think, if we're looking at existential crises, we need to look at. We need to look at, in every case, what can we do about it? But also, is there a danger in some cases of us weakening by doing nothing, or by simply accepting the situation? Now, that seems like a rather complicated moral philosophy, but what I'm getting at is that there's a problem we all have about our own nature as human beings, which is that we are biological creatures who have not yet advanced to anything beyond that, and are probably going to take 30,000 years to do so. And as that sort of creature, we often only advance, we only move forward through struggle. And yet that struggle is painful, causes suffering, and causes death. And my only concern sometimes with futurist thinking is it doesn't recognize that reality about our nature. It doesn't recognize what you would call the existentialist nature of our nature. So it doesn't always get the fact that a beautiful technical solution doesn't solve that problem, because our nature is not to be like that. So world government wouldn't work. So all the things that are socio-political that are coming from our school, if you like, wouldn't actually work because of our own nature.
Keith, any reflections on any of that? Toby talks about in his book about the great reflection, which is ahead. It's a chance to solve some of the bigger, longer-term issues without having an existential risk hanging over our heads. But I think there are moral and ethical questions that do need to be addressed a lot sooner.
Yes, and that's part of the book which I confess that I don't know, so I will have to bow to you on that, as that's not an area that I'm fully familiar with. But I think there. And so Tim's talking about our nature requires this struggle, and perhaps the thing is that our nature has to change, and we have to change it. I would make one very small minutiae point that I would consider gamma ray bursts to be something that we can do something about, and we can do something about that by spreading humanity away from Earth into the solar system and beyond, and then it becomes something that if gamma ray burst gets worse, then humanity can continue elsewhere.
That's
Can
interesting.
I challenge that, David, briefly? Can I just challenge one thing?
Please do.
Nature has to change. Nature has.
No, I didn't mean.
Bear with me. My point is not to be critical of you at all, because in fact I do get where you're coming from. I get there's a degree of natural utopian idealism about this, but I look at us, and I'm saying to myself, as somebody who's an existentialist who likes to think of themselves as transhumanists in that context, I look at it and I say, it is going to take thousands and thousands of years for us to change. And so, in a way, these wonderful ideas about us all becoming little creatures who wander around the universe, who might live in little boxes under the ground while gamma rays float over us. All this is wonderful science fiction stuff. But most of us, most of the time, and the human species for the next foreseeable period, and in a way you're talking about something post-human. You're not talking about humanity, you're not transhumanity. You're talking about post-humanity. And post-humanity isn't human. So you could say post-humanity is an existential risk to humanity. You could say that your post-human dreams are actually the ultimate existential risk to humanity, more than gamma rays and supervolcanoes and nuclear war.
I think you could say that, but I mean, you look at the human position now, and you look at ourselves and our values compared with centuries ago, and you see how we've changed, and people from the past would be horrified by the views that people have today, and people, even if they're regular biological humans, sort of 100 or 200 years from now, will probably be horrified by the views that we have. So I think on that kind of, and I think that evolution towards changing ethics and a post-human existence is a more natural thing that can maintain humanity. But I do see where you're coming from, and it is a point, and are ultimately, if we're all virtual humans running on servers, is that too horrible to contemplate and we've lost our potential, or is it something that we should be looking forward to because of the great things we can create in that environment? But anyway, that's probably getting a little off topic, so I feel back to David.
Thanks, Keith. I'll maybe close you down for the time being and bring you back in later.
For sure.
Thanks. My own answer there is that we need to know what's possible and what's not possible. Some of the changes may seem like science fiction, some of them may not be possible at all, but others, if we investigate, may well be within our grasp. That's where we need to go step by step, looking carefully at what the best evidence shows us. In the conclusion of his book, Toby discusses the possibility that it may not be strictly Homo sapiens in the future. We might evolve further, and we might decide it's good that we evolve further, but not every evolution is something we would actually agree to. If in the process we stopped being conscious beings, we might be more intelligent. Our descendants might be AIs that are vastly more intelligent than us, but lack any feeling or consciousness. That is almost certainly something we would not want to endorse. So we need to have a good moral discussion about these things. I've been trying to invite one or two others on the screen. I'm not quite sure how well the system is working based on people who have asked questions. I'm trying to see how this works. Forgive me for not being fully on top of this, because I don't want to try and just answer all the questions by myself. I would appreciate some help here. There is a question which has the most votes, which I will address briefly, which is, how do we address the tendency of political systems to resist improvements that they perceive as disruptive? I think this is a very hard question, but there have been political systems that have been evolved in the past. They have been led by force of public desire for change. And always inside these political systems which have appeared monolithic, which have appeared to stand against changes, there usually are at least some factions that are more open to expressions of public mood. And so the possibility there is that as the public finds ways to express strong desires, then the political system might evolve. The other thing to look at is the possibility of inspiration from elsewhere. This is the beauty of not having one single government around the world, but having significant autonomy. Today, we are already looking with great interest at how different countries are responding to COVID. We're looking with some fear, with some hope that other countries might have systems of dealing with COVID-19, which turn out to be better than what we have in our own country. And are we ready to respond to that? Even though the governments may have publicly committed to an earlier course of action. So that's some of my answer on that. Let's try and invite Alvaro onto the screen, see whether that works, to ask his question. And let's also invite Max onto the screen to discuss some of the points that you have raised. I'm not sure whether this is working, either Max or Alvaro. And I tried one or two others. It's possible to participate, by the way, if you don't have a camera, you can still speak up, I think. So it's not necessary to have a camera to get involved in the discussion. Let's see. Hi. So Max, you've made quite a few interesting comments. Why don't you take the time to state some of them and then emphasize the points you think deserve attention?
Yeah, so my position is that any attempt within the current political and economic framework is futile, and that the very structural dynamics and incentives of our socio-economic system inhibit any effective response to existential risk. So I put up a sort of formula that rival or zero-sum dynamics, so competing nation states, corporations, and even individuals, plus exponential tech equals civilizational self-determination. So essentially, if you have this competitive relationship between institutions and society as a whole, your civilization will self-destruct. And these are termed the generator functions, and they act as a design constraint for a viable civilization. So if your civilization is competitive in combination with exponential tech, it's not a viable civilization, and you'll fail to surpass the great filter. So I commented on someone else's post regarding what I regard as the correct approach, which is to start a non-profit, self-sufficient, high-tech eco-city that acts as a civilizational model or template that can then self-replicate as it acquires more resources and more of a following, and it can outcompete corporations and nations as it becomes more desirable and more efficient and larger. So it's in this way, it would act as sort of like a corporation in its own right, because it would have to beat corporations at their own game in the market by providing goods and services that were of a superior quality at a lower cost. So you're using the competitive dynamics of market capitalism against itself, to conclude.
You were saying earlier that the competitive marketplace was bad and destructive.
Mm-hmm.
But now you're talking about, in a sense, there will be a kind of competition here, nevertheless.
Yeah, it's a necessary evil, I suppose.
I think your view is quite far from the mainstream. Is saying that it's impossible to solve these problems within the existing world system. There have been existential problems that have been solved within the existing world system. One great example is the threat to the ozone layer, which could have been devastating. Some of the people working in chemical companies almost joked when they were once asked, "How's your job going?" His wife asked him, and he replied, "Well, my job's going fine, but we might just be destroying the world," because of the emissions of, I think it was CFCs, particular chemicals used in refrigerations and aerosols, which were having this unexpected impact on the ozone layer and allowing more deadly radiation. But companies guided by politicians under the basis of the Montreal Agreement, which some people have said, I think Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, declared it as possibly the best agreement in the history of mankind. It set the framework in which companies could compete to have new solutions that didn't involve CFC. So I'd be interested to hear your argument that we can't solve existential crises within the framework of what I would call is a mixed economy, some market actions with some public government oversight.
Well, I'd say that the key distinction now from the past is that it's no longer just a few state or large international actors. This is what Bostrom points out in his paper, that the technology is becoming so much more sophisticated and accessible that someone could 3D print a virus or some type of weapon. And for example, drones, they're much more common and accessible now. You could modify them and have an autonomous weapon system. So the stakes are higher now because there's multiple agents as opposed to just two super powerful nation states. So I'd say that's why you can't have the same solutions of a supranational like contract or agreement.
And are there some examples that you've seen of these possible new groups that aren't just the non-profits like the bodies I mentioned earlier, the Future of Humanity Institute, the FLI and CSER? They're all non-profits. They depend upon philanthropic funding. They're not business groups. But you're suggesting people need to go further than that. They need to actually live in a sort of a non-profit way. Is there any examples that you would particularly highlight as worth looking at more?
I'd say a promising new model is proposed by regen villages, but they're a corporation, but they're and it's necessary to be within the current economic system. But they're constructing high-tech, self-regulating eco-villages. Also, I'd point to Jack Fresco's City Systems as another prominent example. But currently, neither of which have been constructed, but I think they're looking to have finished construction by 2020 for regen villages.
And we should mention, I think something you also put in the chat, if I remember correctly, the initiative by the World Future Society, developing a Civ Type 1 forum, in which, again, they're trying to figure out what could be done to act in a new way in a community. This would be a virtual community rather than an actual community, but I think it's worth looking at. There have been previous groups such as Zero State, which was an initiative kicked off in Europe, in Britain, with some attention worldwide. Again, it's hard to get these going. And the question is, how do we bridge our idealism with these things and practical benefits? But I think we need to experiment. We do need to work very hard at this. So any final comments before I close down your video? By the way, what do you represent, or are you just an individual, Max?
I'm an intern at the World Future Society and a philosophy student.
You're an intern at the World Future Society?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So are you able to say anything more about what the World Future Society are doing in this field?
They've just launched the Civ Type 1 initiative, which is the objective of co-creating new civilizational systems to replace the failing ones that we're stuck with now. Right.
Well, people can find out about that from Googling World Future Society. Thanks so much, Max. So we'll spend a few more minutes online. I've invited Keith back because he's been making a few more comments, for example, about seasteading and possibly some of the other topics. And I'm also going to invite Ed Dowding into the conversation as well, if you're willing to come back. Keith, what else have you heard that you'd like to comment on?
And so I didn't have a lot to add apart from my comments on the side there, but I mean, what Max was saying was quite interesting. I've been looking at sort of decentralized technologies and giving control back to communities, and I do see that as a way of changing the way that we think and we prioritize, and replacing some of the sort of corporate nature of the world and the way that things are out of our control and not necessarily acting in the best interests of humans because there are other priorities, which is crazy. And I just mentioned seasteading as something during that conversation as a way of having communities on the high seas, separate from any kind of national jurisdictions, who can decide to determine to live in a new way, basically, and explore some of these ideas, which I think you may get in, say, future space colonies as well. I mean, how do you maintain law and order if you end up having significant settlements on the moon or further afield on Mars or something like that? You're not going to be able to maintain order from Earth, and that will become sort of decentralized government and people will make their own decisions.
Right. Maybe you can help me, Keith, answer this question as well. To what extent should we worry about the massive misinformation and collective irrationality caused by the widespread use of social networks? Is that a serious existential risk, or is it a risk factor that makes all the other existential risks worse?
It's something that I worry about, but I don't know what the solution is. I mean, in a way, again, I mean, so people have agendas beyond disseminating truth and accurate information, and those agendas are driven by sort of financial reasons or power reasons or mischief or national destabilizing other people. And again, if you had a sort of massively decentralized infrastructure, there are arguments of how you would be able to regulate that better, and you wouldn't censor content, but you would curate content in a different way that would make it easier for people to access what was valid and useful and separate the signal from the noise that way. But I'm probably not explaining that very well, sorry.
I think this is a very hard problem. We don't want to shut down whistleblowers, but we do want to stop people giving a whole pile of excrement into the public square. Yeah? So there's been a lot of argument recently about a particular show in the UK. It's called London Real, and they invited somebody on called David Icke, who is full of interesting ideas, shall we say. And he was advocating on this, that the COVID is caused by 5G. So I'm told, I didn't watch. And YouTube took down the video, and other people are saying, no, they shouldn't have brought it down. We should leave people to make up their own minds about this. You know, people are mature. If we hide it, then there's a reason to hide it. And I think it's very hard to getting the balance in this right. But there are some things that we do demand a higher standard for. We don't allow people to shout fire, fire in crowded places. There are certain other things which we judge to be too inflammatory. There are certain standards that we might expect. And so I think this is hard, but we need to deepen our sophistication in this particular area.
I agree. We need new and better tools for it, for sure. And I think the curation rather than censorship, I mean, it sounds a good idea, but how you do that in practice is, of course, extremely difficult.
Great. Thanks. I've also invited Charles Towers Clark up on the screen. I think he's joining us. Let's see how the technology works. I've had more rejections. I'm feeling a bit rebuffed. I think too many people are watching this in the midst of having dinner or in the states of undress or whatever. But Charles, by all means, tell people who you are and raise some of the points that you've been posting about.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've been harking on about the human side. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Weird CEO, which is about trying to get people to take initiative. And this is the part of the conversation that I'm not really quite understanding, because there seems to be a lot of emphasis on a few people who would need to make decisions, or a few people who would have to be very active in terms of taking the steps necessary to avoid our collective destruction. But how do we change the mentality of more people? I mean, I hate to use the word, but masses. How do we change the mentality of the masses so that people take the collective responsibility that's necessary?
Well, I think this comes back to the question of the kind of conversations that we're having. We do need to find ways to tap into people with multiple backgrounds. It's my observation that people who are often thought of as being stupid or limited can actually contribute a great deal to discussions when the circumstances are right. And we need to find a way to make them feel welcome, to encourage them, and to not talk down to them in any sense, but to get them involved. I do not think we will solve this with any top-down solution. It needs to be something that is bought into. To an extent, some of the way in which the lockdown has been put in place in some countries has been successful because the people have sort of wanted it even more than the governments have wanted it. And so they've come along. It's been something that's been jointly decided in parallel by the bulk of the population and the government. Whether that's the right answer or not is still an open question, but it shows that there can be two levels of discussing this. Keith, do you have something to say on that?
Yes, I think that's a really interesting point from Charles, and I was going to use an example of artificial intelligence and superintelligence that you were talking about earlier, and say, for instance, when the London-based company DeepMind was bought by Google, one of the stipulations of that sale was that Google would institute an ethics committee to oversee the AI research that they were doing there. And there's been a lot of criticism of that, and I think rightly so. In many ways it was well intentioned, but why should those people be the people who determine what the future should be? Like you're saying, Charles, a small group of humans, what is special about them? And so I mentioned decentralization earlier, and I think fundamentally one of the issues this might come down to is ownership. And if everybody in the whole world somehow has ownership of advanced artificial intelligence, then we all become responsible, and we all are much more able to safeguard a good future and prevent the bad actors, rather than if there's just a handful of people who are trying to do that job. So that's a way that I'm looking at the future at the moment, but it's not sort of fully formed in my head. But I think you're right, it shouldn't be a small group, it's got to be something that involves everybody. And I think that sort of decentralized future might be a way of involving everybody and investing them in what happens to us going forward.
It's interesting the comment Max has made. It's not necessary for everyone to be emotionally or intellectually convinced. If we actually create a new desirable model, they will come. I'm going to go outside the realms of this conversation a little bit. In my own company, I let people choose their own salaries. And I did a whole bunch of things to try and get people to take ownership. And the biggest struggle I've had all the way through is getting people to take responsibility. And the system we have at the moment is not one which encourages people to take initiative or responsibility. And when you take this into this discussion, I just don't see how we can move forward into a situation where people are going to want to deal with these issues at all. I take your point, Max, that maybe you need to create a new desirable model, but then who is it who's deciding what that desirable model is?
I've invited, just at the last few minutes, I've invited another couple of people. To whoever gets to the invite first, there's Aboyne, James and Anika. I will refer to one example in which people changed their minds about an existential risk, and that was the existential risk of asteroids colliding with the Earth. One thing that made a difference here was the Schumacher-Levy comet, which was something that people predicted was going to smash into Jupiter. And people looked, and it did smash into Jupiter quite vividly, and people could see there was a huge hole made. Shortly afterwards, Hollywood did its best, and it came up with two films, one called Deep Impact and one called, I forget what the other one was called. Armageddon, yes. And although they weren't completely scientifically accurate, shall we say, sending oil riggers out into space maybe wasn't technically, but it did create a partisan consensus in America that there should be more effort put into tracking asteroids, and that's what took place. Anika, thanks very much for joining us. What would you like to add to the conversation? Maybe you could introduce yourself as well.
Hi, thanks first to everyone who's been contributing. It's been really interesting. I have been thinking a lot about what I was calling before cognitive liberty, like freedom of mind, freedom of thought, freedom from the manufacturing of our desires. And then came to the idea that actually it'd be more like cognitive anarchy rather than liberty. Like how do you get away from the systems of oppression that are shaping our desires in a certain direction? And it's interesting seeing people. The economy is based on the assumption that the consumer is a rational being making decisions on how they spend their money in a rational way. Yet the advertising industry is hugely successful because ads are able to tweak the emotions of the consumer in such a way that they don't realize why it is that they desire a certain product. For example, Coca-Cola is meant to be synonymous with joy. And you could list a whole load of products like that. And so where I'm seeing comments which are rightly saying who should get to decide on what people want if they aren't able to kind of choose their desires for themselves, or if all of our minds are manipulable. And it's a difficult ethical question, like who should decide? Should anyone decide? But right now we're living in an environment where those decisions are being made and that manipulation is happening. So we need some tools for counter persuasion, some sort of defenses against the ways in which we're being persuaded, not because those ways are wrong and we shouldn't want those things, or there is like one metric of progress and value that is better than the others, but just because if there's an entire industry pointing us in one direction, we should at least have the opportunity to build some resilience against that in case we'd autonomously want to choose in the other direction. Does that make sense?
Yes. So any comments on that before I offer mine? Do you want to say anything on that, either of you?
I just say very quickly that and we have all these, we're bombarded by conventional adverts and adverts on social media and social media memes and things like that. And you're right, we need defenses. And also, it's just worth bearing in mind that we're at such an early stage, and social media wasn't invented very long ago at all. And it's what we see now is nothing to how it's going to be in 10 or 20 years' time, and what the world's going to be like. And so hopefully those ideas, those defenses will emerge, because everybody recognizes that we need them desperately, but of course we need to encourage that. I don't know what the answer is, but obviously that's right.
But people have been led into over-consumerism a long time ago. I mean, Veblen talked about conspicuous consumption. What is it, about 100 years ago? We are not fully rational beings, of course. And I agree with the comment that Pute made, that we should help people to be stronger to resist advertising. But it's not just a rational thing. It's I think it goes beyond a matter of rationality. It's a matter of providing more of a sense of fulfillment and comfort away from possessions. Not that possessions are wrong. So my view is that the answer is, in a mixed economy, there's nothing wrong with the free market so long as the free market is constrained by democratic oversight, and from time to time we step in to prevent various market failures. And this is the conversation we need to have. If we don't address this properly, we have the risk that the risk factors will be exacerbated, and we're more likely to end up in a really bad situation.
But Pute's put it quite well, actually. It's education. If we dealt with it in education, if we gave children the defenses or the ability to argue and take and see what's rational and what's not rational, then we wouldn't necessarily be in such a bad situation later on. And that's down to our educational system and the fact that it's an industrial method of education, which radically needs to change. But that's a very long way away from the future of the world.
Anika?
I to some extent agree. Sorry. I agree with that to some extent, in that I heard one example of someone say that they one task that they had at school was to deconstruct ads. So they had a class where they were deconstructing, what are the trigger points in this ad that are targeting which emotions of mine. I thought it was brilliant. If all kids did that, that would be fantastic. But also, even if the education system did change, we're most, I can't remember which study it was that I'm referring to here, but we're most influenced as kids by our peers and by what our friends are interested in and looking up to. And as long as entertainment and media encourages certain ideas of what success looks like, I don't know that the education system alone could really help. And I think arguably, if all media and entertainment pointed us in a different direction, people could potentially make their own decisions regardless of the education system.
The good thing is we're talking about a very, very long time. So if we can change the educational system, specifically really focus on those who are below, take that comment from the Abbot, give me a boy before the age of 7. If we can focus on that and over a number of generations, instill the idea of questioning everything that's being put in you. You might end up with anarchy, I suppose, but then you've got some chance to do it, but it's going to take generations.
It's past 8:30. I'm going to close down this discussion, even though it's fascinating, because I value all of your times. Thank you very much for participating. I just got a few final comments before I shut down completely. I will say goodbye to everybody who has participated. Thanks so much. I'm interested in feedback as to whether this works better or worse from an audience point of view than Zoom. I'm still making my mind up about that. There will be another London Futurists event, in fact, on Saturday, on which I have 3 panelists lined up that should be announced very soon. It's not yet online, but it will be looking at what are the key dimensions to discuss a post-coronavirus future. What are the big decisions that sort of stand above all others? And once you've got two dimensions, of course, you've got 4 scenarios, and then we can help to discuss. So I've got a number of people lined up for that. Also, if you're interested in some of the other things that are lined up, there is a discussion I'll be doing about an ethical topic, which is death. And that is happening on the 15th of April. It is being run by Dismantle Ideas, in which I'm talking about some of the possibilities for dealing with death in new ways. And that's a topic that's in our minds because of the daily death statistics from coronavirus, as it turns out. So thanks very much for all the participation. Sorry for the teething problems and the internet outages, but I'm glad to see there's still more than 30 people avidly going. I'm going to shut down the call now, so the chat will stay alive for some time. And you can replay this whole conversation at any time by coming back to the URL after a very slight delay whilst Crowdcast processes. Thank you very much.